Welcome, everyone. My name is Platon Isaias. I am the head of program, Projective Cities MPhil in Architecture and Urban Design here at the AA. This is the sixth and last lecture of the series we have been organizing this term, titled Practices and Pedagogies. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Manager, the head of public program at the AA, for their support, generosity, and incredible help in the past couple of weeks, but not only. As a program, we've tried to do events always within the wider, let's say, framework of the school, and we always appreciate exposing our ideas and guests to the wider audience of the school and beyond. Today, we are incredibly happy to have with us Plan Común, Felipe de Ferrari from the collective, who will talk about framing commons. That's the title of the presentation. The lecture will introduce the attitude, strategies, and projects produced by Plan Común during the last 9 years, with a specific focus on housing projects developed in collaboration during the last 3 years. Felipe de Ferrari, who delivered the lecture from Plan Común, is a Chilean architect and co-founder of OnArchitecture and the practice, of course, Plan Común. His articles and interviews have been published in 2G, AA Files, Architectural Review, Archithese, ARC Plus, and San Rocco, among others. He's co-curator of conference program 2020-2022 by Lisbon Architecture Triennale, and he's a teacher, academic at the Universidad Católica de Chile before and at the MARQ UC from 2020. Felipe, welcome. We're very happy to have you with us this afternoon. The virtual floor, the wall is yours.
Good afternoon, Platon, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's for me, of course, it's a pleasure to share some ideas with you in the context of Projective Cities program, and of course, a pleasure also to be part of the program of the Architectural Association, an institution we have been following since several years. Even we were students back in the day at Universidad Católica. So my presentation, it will be entitled Framing Commons, and you can read in between the lines or afterwards this idea of the in-between as a project. I will try to introduce, of course, our last the work we have been done in our studio during the last years, but also more information about the context in how we started to deal with some issues at the studio, right? So first of all, I will go briefly on this, but actually it's quite important to say that Plan Común was founded back in 2012 in parallel with another project, which is entitled OnArchitecture, which is an audiovisual archive of architecture, a project we started back in the day at the Universidad Católica around 2006 or 2007. We started to film architecture and doing interviews to architects, urban designers, and so on and so forth. But the idea actually was, back in the day, was to really approach, to be close to the architectures we were interested at that moment, and to try to represent them in a clear way, right? So you will understand why I will take some minutes to introduce this project as well. In a way, this has been, of course, very important for our own critical thinking and for our own formation as architects, because even though it's an archive and you can understand that we could be perhaps kind of to have a journalist approach, it's not at all like this. Since the very beginning, we imagine us as practitioners, and then how we could fit our practice with a, let's say, very diverse group of architects. So the idea behind that is that architecture is a common field of knowledge, which means that it can be applied by any community in any place, and I will say even by non-architects. It's about strategic thinking dealing with form and dealing with resources. So basically, we can find architecture all over in our cities, not necessarily the one signed by architects. So I will go, yeah, this is very slow, I don't know, yeah. So basically, these are these two projects somehow. On the one side, a collection of films since 2008, and then a collection of projects we started doing in 2012. As I said, OnArchitecture is an audiovisual archive of architecture. At the moment, we have around 600 videos. We are producing the last 50 to arrive to 600 videos by the end of April somehow. It's a content done by me and another Chilean architect, Diego Gras. As I said, it originally was a student project, and then we continue as professionals, and in a way allow us to really approach and to visit to get content from first hand. I would say it's a collection of buildings, portraits, and interviews. All the material produced since 2008. Of course, it has been a super interesting, let's say, way to approach people we really like, we really respect, and people that has been extremely influential in our thinking. I'm not talking only about contemporary architects, but also architectures mainly from the modern period, I would say. And then, of course, trying to all the time enlarge the questions and the subjects that in which architecture operates, right? We are not talking only about form, but actually more, larger questions. And then we have been very privileged in a way to really talk about these questions and subjects with many people and people with very different approach and attitude regarding architecture in itself. From very conceptual, very highly conceptual people to very practical people in a way. And this, of course, it has been also about the possibility, it allows us the possibility to visit places, many places, and to comprove or to confirm, let's say, strategies by many architects from South America, from Europe, from Asia, and so on and so forth. Of course, with this specific I will say interest in collective spaces. Of course, this has been also the possibility to look for, let's say, how we live and how we live in, of course, in individual houses, but also, and I will say since during the last 5 years with more intensity, how we live in collective housing, right? This material is all the videos are available in this site, and I strongly encourage you to visit the website, as Architectural Association is subscribed for the first time during this year, if I'm correct. So basically, we have been what we have been doing actually. So during the last 5 years, I will say there is a strong emphasis on housing, and then, as I said, how we live together through many approaches, right? So we have been reviewing and visiting student housing, social housing, real estate housing, and so on and so forth. Housing in South America, housing in Europe, cooperatives. You know, you already have an idea. And then, of course, we are trying also to understand the questions and subjects behind some strategies of architecture, which means we try to really understand the complexity of these spaces, not only from a, let's say, formal point of view or a spatial point of view, but also finance point of view, administrative, and so on and so forth. There are, you might know this case very well. I'm not sure if Cristina is here today, but of course, LACOL has been also very important as a kind of practice of our own generation, let's say. I still remember I visited the La Borda cooperative when it was on construction site. Then I met Paul for the first time to talk about the process. Then we met with Cristina and Carles. Then we came back to see the post-occupancy. So it means that it has been, of course, an amazing way to approach architecture and to really see carefully these places, because we spend time there. This is the basic as we are recording, we spend time, we see details, and we try to, of course, to do a nice portrait of them. And then, of course, as I was saying, it's about also the conditions. So in this case, for example, this was our my last visit in Chile some weeks ago. And of course, we went to see the housing, a very exemplary housing project in the center of Santiago, but also we met the associations that are dealing with this housing deficit and also the authors of the project. So we start to understand the picture in a much more complex way. This is about OnArchitecture, and OnArchitecture, I have to say, this has been extremely influential in our work as Plan Común. Coming back to one of the first slides, we understand architecture as a common field of knowledge, and in this sense, we take many ideas by our colleagues. It's not that we see competition, but actually that many ideas are part of our universe, and we can of course appropriate them and translate them to other contexts. Plan Común was founded in 2012. It's a practice that was founded originally in Santiago, in Chile. And let's say our agenda back in the day, and still now, was to try to reinforce the collectivity, to reinforce public, at that time, public space or collective space. We can talk about the distinction afterwards, but actually through all the means of architecture, let's say discourse, research, design, and building. We like also to understand that everything can be a project. Architecture is not only about built objects or buildings, but actually it's about research, it's about publishing architecture, it's about sustaining a critical discourse, right? So we founded back in the day the practice in Chile, and then since September 2018, Plan Común is based in Paris. You can have an idea of the people here, our team. And I have to say, first of all, that we are a kind of conventional practice. We are not a collective nor a cooperative, or at least still. We are just architects we are running a practice. Back in the day in Chile, with a special focus on public space and public facilities, I will say. You can have a glimpse of our, let's say, work there and the scale of our team. And then the second phase, when we are 4 partners, 3 French architects, Sacha Discours, Kim Courrèges, and Nissim Hagenauer, plus me. And then I will say our special focus since then, during the last 3 years and a half, we have been doing projects in Paris, in the European context, has been especially focused on housing and transformation. You will see a little bit of this. But then we can perhaps come back to the first question, and let's say the first one of the first images we have in mind back in the day. We founded Plan Común in 2012, 1 year after a huge student movement in Chile in 2011 that started all this historical transformation that we are having now. Let's say at this moment, for the ones that are not following the situation in Chile. The new constitution is being, we are writing the new constitution, and then there is a new president, probably, that opens a new historical cycle there. You might know that Chile is a very hardcore neoliberal experiment. Probably Alejandra Celedón introduced you to this subject some weeks ago, and then to go let's say straightforward to the point, it's about how we understand common sense, and we have the intuition that common sense at this moment is neoliberalism, right? So it means to really try to understand which is our position, and as architects in this context, right? As our friend, German friend Wilfried Kuhn has been stated, let's say, architects are reduced to simple being collaborationists. So it's about how we really position ourselves in this context. And we had this idea since the very beginning. So since the very beginning, since we founded the practice, we started our kind of research, very informal, I have to say, with many contributors, a research that it was in the beginning initiated in the core of Plan Común, but then we started to open it to many contributors and friends all over the world. And it was a kind of very direct attempt on the question on collective spaces, on how to imagine possibilities for our public spaces and for our collective space, right? So we started this series of 45 strategies that were dealing with many subjects, many diverse subjects in our cities, let's say, from malls to, let's say, cemeteries, and trying to really improve and reinforce the collectivity through form, through architecture, let's say. So we have this. This was still the first one produced in our studio. It was entitled Public Buildings, and the idea was to really to have like a squares on air, very simple, as a kind of prototype. And then I have to say also the context where, let's say, also they were not strategies located in a specific context, but everything was somehow created so we could imagine that one strategy could be appropriated and translated in another context, right? The idea was not only, let's say, to say, okay, we are architects and we have many ideas and we know how to represent them, but actually one of the goals of this research was actually to try to give these inputs to our, well, of course, academy, but decision makers and so on and so forth, authorities, in a way to really to feed their own parkour and their own, universe of possibilities when we are talking about our cities, for example. This case, for example, this case, I just choose a couple of them, but actually, for example, this one was to create public pools, really swimming pools in the cities without any kind of bureaucracy, without any kind of filter in between the city and then the pool. Or this one by our friends from Chilean practice Umwelt, where they decided actually to really transform the area around the malls, which is a typology very present in the Chilean context, but not reclaiming everything, not expropriating the, let's say, the monster, the blind box, but actually to try to transform its surroundings, right? This series has been, of course, introduced in several places, in several exhibitions. The idea was, since the very beginning, was to publish the book with all the material, and we are already in 2022, and we weren't able to do it. But somehow, the good thing about these exhibitions is that the material has been continuously show in different places, right? So, for example, this one was a presentation we did, we were invited in Chicago Biennale last year. You can see here on the right, the first time that they were exhibited in the Swiss Architecture Museum, all the collection, let's say, all the cases together. Then on the left, you can see an exhibition we did in Belgrade, showing again the cases and trying to, of course, using other means to engage the interested people that went to visit the exhibition. In the meantime, we of course we have been we are, let's say, we took this idea of, at one moment, very important by Lina Bobardi, this idea of poor architecture, and architecture able to communicate and with maximum dignity through minor and humble means, let's say, to try to really to build a case around the projects, to look for the right strategies, let's say, and to try to also to do almost nothing in this idea of economy of means, right? So, for example, back in the day, I will show you a couple of projects made in Chile, and then I will jump to the ones which have been doing the last years in Paris. This was one of the first ones, very important. It was the first time we got a prize in an open competition. It was for the new building in our architecture school in Santiago, in the Universidad Católica. And then what you will see here is that basically we took directly the strategy by Lacaton and Basal, the idea of extra space, and we really use it for another subject in Chile in another context. And the idea was that the project was, our proposal was rather than to do a new building, actually, that was suggested, demanded by the brief, our idea was really to transform an existing building that was next to the one that the brief was proposing, right? So in a way, it was about this, translation of received ideas somehow. This was also another open competition we like a lot. This was public facilities in the south of Chile. It was an stadium, and then of course coming back to the stadiums, during the first meeting, or the first, let's say, approach to the subject, this was this model really in our heads, the La Bombonera Stadium for Boca Juniors in Argentina, a very, very interesting typology of the stadium. And you could see here that then you have 3 sides with the graderías, let's say, with seats for all the people, and then you have a bar that is somehow having the VIP for the public, most important people there, like even important football players that were attending matches there. So, and then we arrived to this idea. Basically, it's the same. Sorry, this is kind of slow, a little bit slow. Yeah. So it's somehow the same idea, just translated into another context. And then we were of course proposing somehow this VIP space, but also a promenade along all over the stadium, and then the extra space, which is an idea very, very important in our work, to offer something more, something else, something that was unsolicited by the brief. So in this case, we were proposing an extra, let's say, gym facilities with views towards the city. Let's continue with this idea of instead of, or trying to offer an extra space. This was a competition of a memorial for a very important Chilean architect that was Fernando Castillo Velasco. Not only architect, actually, but politician. He was mayor and so on and so forth. And then the idea was, the brief was really to do a small memorial over here in this park, and then to do to transform a parking into a kind of a small park in the context of a larger park you can see here. But then what one of the first things we saw is that actually the brief was totally wrong, in the sense that the monument was already there. The monument was already there, and it was this compound, this housing complex made by the office of Fernando Castillo Velasco, along 3 other partners, let's say. So we said, instead actually to do a small memorial that probably not a lot of people will see in the ground of this park, perhaps we can take the opportunity to transform, to update the condition of the housing project, and to transform it into a proper monument for architecture in facing actually an urban context, which you can see here next to the, let's say, the monument for neoliberalism, which is Costanera Center Tower in the middle of Santiago, Providencia district. So we were saying, perhaps we just need to really transform and to take advantage of the roofs of this complex, right? And in a way, not only doing an homage to the one architect, but actually to crowning 4 towers, as the project was done by 4 partners back in the day, right? You can see it here. So basically, in the public round, let's say, we did only a few adjustments in order to repair the condition and establish connections in between different levels. Very, very minimal, almost nothing, I would say. And then what let's say, all of our energy was really up, let's say, trying to transform, let's say, a humble monument in a monumental monument within the city of Santiago. And then by doing so, you will see that if we come back to the image, sorry, here, there was a quote by Fernando Castillo Velasco display in the upper tower that was "Todo el pueblo es arquitecto," all the people is architect. And then the idea was actually to display this message, and in the upper tower, actually, to take advantage of this new crown, to create a space for the inhabitants there, for the neighbors, were living in that tower, right? Let's continue. And in this case, a museum, very big international exhibition competition in Hungary, in one part there called Városliget. And then we were working in the design of both architecture and photography museum. We were finalists, which was also important. It was the first time we were selected in a competition, shortlisted in an international competition. Of course, very important for a very small practice. So again, the strategy is not the same, but the attitude it is. We took all the program demanded by the brief, let's say all the galleries, all the rooms for exhibition rooms and so on and so forth, and we buried them. We have them all in the underground, and then all the administrative rooms, for like people working there, whatever, we had this in the upper part, in the last floor, right? And by doing this, we create a space, an extra space in between them, which was totally non-solicited by the brief, which is this kind of triple high volume of air that will be in our idea, was actually in our proposal, was really a place for gathering, but also creating connections with the museum in front. And this was something also, perhaps this is also important to say, that the brief was really suggesting to have the buildings positioned, let's say, in parallel to the main avenue. And then we totally decided to have them in front of each other in order to create an extra space in between two buildings, right? So there is a volume of air in the interior, there is another volume of air in the interior of the other museum, and then an in-between space, creating, let's say, something that we were thinking perhaps it's a ground where all mix somehow. The exhibitions of architecture and photography can at one moment find a common ground, right? We'll continue, and then another one, which is an urban project of public space also in Santiago, in the city center. It was called Market Esplanade, and actually with the name you can immediately understand a little bit. It was creating like horizontal walkable surface in a very kind of highly difficult place with a lot of people, a lot of transit, and so on and so forth. So we said, instead of having this, trying to create this esplanade that will be a huge effort, and we knew at that moment that it was impossible to pay for it. So we said, perhaps on the contrary, we can deal with fragmentation, and perhaps we can try to reinforce a specific points on this area, let's say, and to try to create new relationships in between what is there. Let's say, for example, I don't know, the market hall or many kind of historical buildings, and then new infrastructure, new social infrastructure that could, of course, update the condition of this area, right? So it was really basic, but then somehow effective in the way we were really dealing with economy of means and really with this idea of a constellation, taking advantage of really specific situations there, right? Place for playground for children and so on and so forth. And this idea of the constellation of the, let's say, of to throw something on the fields, we insisted on this idea in a project we did the same year, but in this case in the context of Nove Fujine, which is a neighborhood in Slovenia, in Ljubljana, sorry, a modern complex of around 15,000 inhabitants. And then what you see here is the Castle, let's say the Museum of Architecture and Design, who commissioned us, actually, along with the landscape architect Tiago Torres Campos. They commissioned us to do an installation or something, or an exhibition within the museum. And then after doing the tour and visiting the place, we proposed them actually to take the part of the effort outside and to try to create connections in between with the neighborhood, right? So what we did, it was very, very simple. It was a series of 5 plinths spread, let's say, located in a specific parts in this context. Sorry, I will come back to the map so you can understand a little bit more. There was a small one next to the last bus stop. There was one in front of the museum. There was another one in the center of the castle. There was another one in front of the community center, and there was another one next to the river, right? All of them with the same type of building technique, very, very simple, concrete blocks, big concrete blocks in the core, and then normal bricks as cladding in the outside in the perimeter. All of them with different sizes, but following the same technique, let's say. So for example, this one is the one next to the social community center. And of course, this is totally rough infrastructure, very, very simple. You can sit there, you can use it for, like many, many activities. But of course, at some specific moments along the year, they are more intensively used, as in this case with the festival of the neighborhood. Or for example, in this case, the one in the interior of the museum, it was used as a display, but also as a place for openings and so on and so forth. So let's jump a little bit to our, let's say, the title of the presentation after this introduction. This idea of framing commons, and especially in this, let's say, second phase of our practice, talking mostly about housing and transformation. When we are saying to frame commons, there are many, many ideas that are there, of course, and they enrich each other. We are talking about the in-between condition, what is in between an interior and an exterior. We are talking about this idea by Lacaton and Basal, the idea of extra space. We are talking also about something which is not non-solicited as a space or as a program in the brief. We are talking about a space of life and freedom, which is it's a challenge for administrations. We can talk about the spatial compensation or even as an added spatial value. We like very much this idea of in-between by Chilean architect called Brenda Kapstein. About you can read a little bit the quote, but actually she was very clear in the way an in-between was these espacios intermedios were, of course, mediating in between an interior and an exterior, and quite defined by the natural elements, sun, wind, rain, and so on and so forth. We had this somehow. We had some experience in dealing with this in the first phase in Chile, but not especially. It was not especially our, let's say, our agenda somehow. I don't remember we did some like collective housing projects there, but then of course we did some proposals for individual houses, such as this one, which was built just before we founded Plan Común, along with one co-founder of Plan Común, Diego Gras, and another friend, Claudio Baladrón. And then you can understand this idea of the in-between. It is a house in a very nice landscape in the north of Chile. And then we decided actually to have, it's very simple to have like the collective area in one side of the house, and then all the rooms all together in the other side. But then there are no corridors, but actually what is articulating everything is a plinth, it's a terrace, a very generous terrace outside. So you can see here, and this is the place. It was let's say a huge, somehow an overscale terrace in front of a kind of very rough context surroundings, and then we had this sand pool just to enjoy sun and so on and so forth. So it means that to go in the house, the idea was actually that if you wanted to go to the kitchen, you needed to pass through the exterior and not through a corridor in the interior. This idea was somehow the same idea with a different form and proportion and so on and so forth. We applied for a house in the south of Chile, actually, You can see it in the plan. You have, let's say, you have a very compact interiors. Then you have an in-between space, which is basically a roof, kind of overscale roof, and then a total exterior, which was the terrace and the pool. You can see a little bit over here. Or even here, which was a social housing prototype that another Chilean architect commissioned us, Felipe, where we were, of course, repeating somehow the same ideas, very also compact kind of interior, leaving two sides, two extremes of the house open, but covered with a roof that could be, of course, at one moment transformed into a store or something like this. But when moving actually to collective housing, we have some very clear things to answer through. So the context, I will, of course, I will be very brief on it, but actually it's about this reality within the global neoliberal framework. We are all aware of this. A housing crisis during the last decades, a huge housing deficit, not only in European cities, but let's say everywhere. And then the last question is, of course, the housing after pandemics and what pandemics show us in a kind of very hard way, the situation of the housing, right? So on the one side, we have this idea of that we are protagonists, we are at the mercy of the protagonists which has nothing to do with planning and design, let's say real estate and speculation. This was part of a dialogue with German architect Jesko Fesser. You can see it a little bit here, right? This at one moment in Chile, some years ago, we started to talk about vertical ghettos, which were really housing, small units of housing, a consequence of just a pure speculation, let's say. So people, like investors, were buying floors, like several floors, and then renting to really fragile people, especially immigrants, for example. And then on the side, you see this very, I would say, a smart action performance by a series of architects and students of architecture during the demonstrations back in 2019, where they actually did the survey one-to-one in the main square in Plaza Dignidad, where you were seeing really like clearly the lack of space and all the contradictions of the offer that we have in housing at that time in Chile, right? But this is, of course, this is the question of speculation and the rise of the value of the housing is a problem in all of our cities, in all metropolis probably. There are a few exceptions, of course, but then this is mostly the case all over. And then what you also see is there is a strong lack of space, let's say, not only at the scale of the apartment, let's say, not only at the scale of the domestic, but also what's in between your intimate apartment or the intimate space and then the city, right? So this was one article by a series of architects here in France during the pandemic, right? The type of the sizes of the apartments or regarding the offer, let's say. So, and then what you see is, of course, that inhabitants and citizens, they reclaim the space available, let's say, the available space. And in this case, for example, you can find probably other pictures about this, the Brise Soleil in Copan, which is not only during pandemics, but before, it has been used as a kind of extra space for the own apartment. You can enjoy to be in this very kind of, let's say, a specific place open towards the city. We are talking, of course, about Turbo Lepret and all the effort by Lacaton Basal, Drouot, Utan, so on and so forth, really to try to expand and to give more square meters to the apartments. But I will say what is interesting for us as Plan Común is actually the cases that these square meters are really into the collective, not anymore in the private realm, but actually as a space for sharing with your neighbors in places that you could imagine that a community is can be, can gather, right? So in this case, for example, this case is very important. This was the first worker city, cité, sorry, not city, cité in Paris, Cité Napoleon, where you see this, let's say, super generous also volume of air, integrating the circulation and also the accesses, but something more about, let's say, the life of the inhabitants there. Or again, a very inspiring case, La Borda cooperative in Barcelona, when they were really able to offer something totally, let's say, I would say over scale and then generous for the collective, right? So, and in a discussion with Cristina and Carles from La Col, actually, for an interview we did for CCA, from Canadian Center of Architecture, they were really highlighting the potential of these spaces and the how relevant they were during the context of pandemics, right? In a way, we come back to very, like, I will say, direct ideas by previous architects, of course. We are not inventing anything new, but actually, as I said, we are constantly trying to think about pre-existing efforts somehow. And this idea of that there is the circulation, for example, can be a place of something more, a place where you encounter your neighbors, this kind of streets on air. And what we really like about this effort somehow was that these places were at the scale of the building somehow, as in the kind of in Pompidou competition, building. So that somehow these spaces were acting as a kind of device, changing totally the performance of the building, of the programs that were served by the circulation, right? You can see this normally in, let's say, cultural centers, but not necessarily in housing. But sometimes, from time to time, you find these examples on housing as well. And we were also interested, we are still interested, of course, very interested in the, let's say, in the volume of air you can create when there are two structures that, in this case, very similar, that are in front of each other, right? And they create something more, which is outside, let's say, the private realm, or let's say there's your small neighborhood, right? This is a very nice housing complex in Valparaíso in Chile. So I will go briefly through some projects done in the second phase of the of Plan Común, being based in Paris. So basically, I will show you a couple of housing projects where we are dealing with these devices for the collective. Let's say very important devices that are also somehow helping in creating the character, in defining the character of our proposals. They can be very different. We are talking about open air platforms, atriums, patios, or forms, different, let's say, solutions related to circulations. So I will jump into the first one. Very important thing also to insist is that, as you saw probably in all the credits in each project, almost all of the projects we have done in collaboration, not only with specialists, but with other architects, friends from all over. So in this case, for example, it's a big project we are developing at this moment, an open competition from 2019 on housing, on social housing. 185 apartments. The client is the RIBP, which is la Régie Immobilière de la Ville de Paris, which is a kind of real estate from the city of Paris. And then this project was done in collaboration with German practice, Berlin-based practice Kun Malvesi, and French architect Nicolas Dorval-Bory. Perhaps just to kind of a reminder of the interesting this institution, RIVP, which is originally a public housing agency, nowadays is a semi-public company, but actually that is in charge actually of the offer of social housing within Paris, and also to offer spaces for offices and business incubators. The project was located actually in the south of Paris in an ex-hospital, which is called Saint-Vincent-de-Paul, Saint-Vincent-Paul. Next to, actually, you might recognize this nice building by Jean Nouvel, the Fondation Cartier, and this is the ex-hospital. It's a huge development, and unfortunately, in the brief or in the general, let's say, proposed master plan, some of the buildings were decided to be demolished. As in our case, it was totally forbidden to keep it. It was not really desired by the organizers. And some of them, like this one, they will maintain because of their value in history or whatever, the quality of the building. It doesn't matter. But the thing is that we did a project for this in this area. The project actually is I will say it's a kind of hybrid in between an urban block and a series of detached buildings. There was probably the biggest challenge was to deal with the density there. It was quite high, as I told you, 185 or 86 apartments plus commerce plus workshops, so quite dense as a compound, as a complex. So this is basically the form. It's a collection of buildings, all following the same type of constructive system, with a patio in the center, which is connected to the pedestrian boulevard over here. You can see here it's a kind of very, you can see it's a very massive project. There is this the idea was to do this everything on the facade. The facades are in stone, that is working structurally. And then, but perhaps most important for this presentation it's about this type of spaces, the cutouts we have in a series of places in the complex, or before actually. This is something important. When doing the competition, one of the first things was, of course, to try to understand or to insert our project in a kind of local tradition, which was the French or Parisian tradition, as you might call it. And we were visiting and trying to understand two different models or two different projects. On the one side, of course, the work by Fernand Pouillon, French architect, in this case in the Victor Hugo residence in Pantin, in the north of Paris, which is about using stone and very massive kind of type of architecture, and then to come back to this idea offered by Cité Napoleon, where the circulations were something more, right? Something more generous, and they were really a place for life in between for the different neighbors. So dealing with both of them, we arrived to this kind of hybrid where we created, let's say, you had the building, the compact, the massive building over here. For example, in this square, this was one of the buildings somehow, the detail. And then you had the circulations, which were in the building, of course, within the building. And then what you have here is a series of platforms, open or closed. Then we can see the details, but actually they were really kind of open platforms for different uses. In a way, what is interesting, or at least for us was very interesting, is that we were not talking about one building or one conventional building is equal to one community, but actually that this building and this building were collaborating somehow and were having this in between, a place for the encounter of the neighbors of two buildings, right? So you can see here that even though let's say it was quite dense and there are a lot of apartments, we try to insist on the idea to have micro neighborhoods, or let's say somehow neighborhoods with a quantity of apartments that people can talk each other and not having necessarily conflict with each other, right? In the end, we are talking about more or less about 9% of extra surface. This is of course very tricky when you deal with this type of stats, but then you might have an idea, let's say, of the extra space we were adding. Of course, this was undemanded and it was totally presented as vertical commons, something really extra in the project. You can see here the detail of the fourth. The idea is that you have this series of double height spaces, like a kind of small rooms with this side of the facade closed. In the beginning, for the competition, actually, we were enclosing both sides, but then, of course, you might imagine these are spaces which are very challenging for administrations, for issues of security, fire safety, who will run the spaces, and they sometimes administrations can see them as spaces for conflict instead of spaces for opportunity. So in a way, this was also part of the process designing these spaces, right? You are seeing here, for example, the collage we did for the competition, showing the last floor of one of them, where basically we were not asking too much to the neighbors, but actually to leave a couple of plants and to share a table in between two apartments. And then, of course, as we know that even though we are not animators, or it's not that we are super interested in defining everything, we understand that we need to offer some, let's say, basic infrastructure to these spaces to somehow encourage inhabitants. We were also proposing a series of small devices that were in tune with the programmation, with let's say the activities the neighbors, the future inhabitants want in the place. And we even did this model for an exhibition the beginning of 2019, where we were somehow imagine the uses of these vertical commons, and even actually you can see there was another type of definition for the walls, but this is not important anymore. You see here, this is the model of the whole complex. This is our project, and then this one is a project by a French practice called Bourbous Grand George, along with Sergison Bates. And then this one is a transformation by Lacaton and Basal. They won the transformation of the building, of one of the few buildings that the organization keep. Let's continue. This project is about transformation of an existing building. It's a project, actually, a very nice competition by another public institution called Paris Habitat. We arrived finalists in this process. We were selected in between 4, along with 3 other practices, other groups. Unfortunately, we arrived finalists. We were really in the final. That's why we said second prize. But even though perhaps this is not totally official, we associated with the Belgian practice 51 M4E for this transformation. And it's about this tower. You see it here next to the Périphérique, next to the ring road of Paris, and also next to the train lines that goes to the north. So basically a quite amazing urban and difficult, challenging spot. We are talking about a building done in the 50s by a French architect and urbanist called Raymond Lopez, a guy that was able to, he did a lot of housing, around 1,500 units in Paris, very, very important. And what you see here is, of course, the very bad state of the tower at the moment we did the competition. This was a rehabilitation during the 90s, if I remember correctly. But basically, yeah, I can jump to definitely here. You can see it here. This was the original tower, and this tower is quite interesting, with a series of the difference of heights. Let's say the structure is working in 3, let's say 3 areas along the building. And this is somehow a model that Lopez used in several projects, including Turbo-Lepret, because this is very important. Raymond Lopez was also the author of the tower transformed by Lacaton and Basal and Drouot back in 2011 or 2013, I don't remember, but basically some time ago. And what's interesting, most interesting actually, is that Paris Habitat was the commissioner, the client for the transformation of this tower by Lacaton and Basal. And after around 11 years, they went to transform, they proposed to transform the second one, which is Tour de Poissonnière. So basically, we took the idea to learn from Turbo-Lepret seriously, and we really tried to let's say, to clarify our position regarding pre-existences. So the first idea or the first action was to really to deal with the existing, and we decided to move a central lift that was somehow cutting the relationship in between the two extremes of the building, the circulations. There was the lift, to move the lift, and then even to use the original shafts, because you have asbestos, or I don't know how I don't remember how you say it in English, asbesto, so, or amianto.
Asbestos.
Yeah, asbestos, or amianto in French. So basically, we were using the same shafts in order to really to take what was there and to try to fit the new requirements into the pre-existing volume. And then, of course, this idea of adding extra space or adding extra space for the collective, trying to unfold some kind of attitude towards the collective. This one very important thing is that the transformation was from social housing to student housing, plus facilities for La Sorbonne University. So the program, the type of inhabitant change already. This was something to consider. So basically what we did, actually, we come back to this idea of a very challenging place because of the noise, because of the pollution, and so on and so forth. What we decided actually was a very kind of clear, or at least direct proposal, where towards the south and the north, we had spaces for the collective, let's say, for the different inhabitants. Towards the north, a series of winter gardens towards the north, which was let's say, it is the neglected city somehow. And towards the south, balconies and terraces. And then to both east and west, we had, let's say, extra spaces for the apartments. You can see it here. I will not give you all the details of this proposal. Of course, you can see that we were also testing apartments where we share kitchen, and there were many different strategies in order to gather people somehow, creating a clear connection in between the north and the south. And of course, taking advantage of the new circulation we needed to include in the building to create these extra spaces for the collective. What we like a lot, and which is quite very interesting for us, is that, of course, if we were adding like around 9% of surface in the Petit housing project, social housing we are developing, in this case was even a little bit more. You can see it here in the detail. So we were again talking about this idea of micro neighborhoods. So we were not imagining to have like friends, like all the people of 151 apartments, they are all friends, but actually that you have small units within the building, or small micro neighborhoods within the total building. So you see the connection here in between the greenhouse towards the balconies. You see here the extension of the very basic extension for the apartments, that we need to take out the facade, the original facade. Here you see the series of balconies and terraces towards the south. Here you see the connection in the ground, at the ground level, with the arts residence and spaces for La Sorbonne. And then you see in the two sides, towards the north and towards the south, this kind of a scaffolding that you add and create, and it gives somehow defines all the character of the building, basically, of the transformation. And we were, of course, imagining this kind of very contemporary situation, very urban privilege within our cities to really to be exposed almost without any filters towards the city, playing ping pong or doing whatever, something well different according the different levels. And you see it here, basically. And then you see, this is also important that, of course, part of this program was demanded by the brief. For example, a library or a place for cinema or whatever. Basically, some program was really demanded, and we added extra spaces all over the height of the building, creating spaces, for example, for the gym or for a place where you can cultivate species like vegetation or whatever, even the laundry room for the students. I will not give you more details about this one, but of course this is an idea we are of course insisting a little bit. In this case, it was a real estate competition, and the idea was actually how to really link starting from the ground level through this kind of vertical commons and terraces when you go high. Let's say it's a kind of a open parkour, connecting two different buildings, a low one in the corner and a tall one in the background, let's say. And with this, I will finish with this example, because you saw already our interest was about this collective areas within buildings, but we are also coming back to this very nice social housing project in Valparaíso in Chile. We are very interested in between buildings as well, and of course this is much more difficult to deal from within architecture, because we are normally dealing with one building in the city and then the pre-existing condition. But then we had the opportunity to do a very nice competition with our friends from ISSS Research and Urban Planning Practice Urban Studio in Berlin. And the idea was a competition for an eco village in Hanover, in the outskirts of Hanover. And we developed, let's say, a series of different typologies with similarities and differences, offering the same type of somehow in-between space somehow. So it was related to the scale of the different buildings, and sometimes they were greenhouses, sometimes they were open air platforms, and so on and so forth. This was somehow in the M typology, the one we developed further. The idea was coming back again to this idea of Cité Napoleon, but having a larger space for the encounter of the inhabitants, really as a kind of terrace within, in between the apartments, long terrace. And the idea was actually to create a kind of new relationship in the neighborhood through these different typologies, right? So in between spaces that were in front of the building, sometimes in between two buildings, and so on and so forth. And that is the final result. It was about 500 units, apartment units in the outskirts of Hanover, and then I will not give you more details about it, but we play with the grid in order to create an hybrid in between what was there, the city, let's say, the order from the city, and then a new situation in the limit of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe. This was amazing. Thank you so much. The protocol is that we first we open the floor for questions from the audience. Hello, Yushian. Sorry. So yes, we open the floor to questions from the audience. I think we have around 20 minutes, so there's a lot of time. So I will invite everyone that wants to ask a question to make themselves visible, raise your hands or write something in the chat and we will unmute you. Any questions? Raul? Yeah?
Maybe I can start with a question. Thank you very much, Felipe, for your lecture. It was really inspiring. Question is about how are your proposals perceived in terms of when you want to deal with these spaces that are going to be used for different people, and of course they emerge from conversations between you as designers, the ones who are proposing, and then those who are listening to that proposal and accepting it, challenging, maybe changing it during the process. So I would like to hear how that competition that you won has changed or not over the evolution of that. My question is, how does it work in France in terms of, is there like a good reception from developers of housing, be public or private, to listen to proposals of non-defined spaces or spaces that were not part of the brief? Because, for example, if I compare it with what happens here in Spain, where I'm based, it's very difficult that you want to build, or the developer wants to pay, or is willing to pay for more square meters than the one actually was set from the beginning of the brief. So how do you actually envision this process of collaboration with the developer in order to achieve this outstanding result you design?
Super question, Raul. Thank you very much. I will say there are a few things to say. Well, the first thing is that the perception, I will say there are different levels. We are the first, let's say, moment we need to deal with is with the jury. Of course, this is the most of the time what I show you here, they are, I think all of them are competitions. So it means we need to convince a jury, which is quite diverse, and it's sometimes even opposite with the contradictory interests, right? From the city, from decision makers, whatever. So this is the first one. Then you have the clients, which are normally, of course, in the case of the project we are doing in the south of Paris, is this institution called RIVP. And then they are the inhabitants, where in this case also in the Petit, they are future inhabitants that we, as a team, we have introduced our project from time to time, right? So I will say this is the first thing. The second thing I will say is that there is, I will say, generally speaking, there is a good reception of our agenda and even our slogans here in Paris, because I will say slogans because everything can be transformed, of course, and the common is also, at this moment, is almost a cliche, even though we like a lot to talk about commons and to talk about the collective. There is many people talking about them. So imagine that for the re-election of Anne Hidalgo, which is the mayor here in Paris, and now she's running for presidential candidate, she started to talk about Paris en commun, like Paris in common, right? So everyone started to talk about this idea, and all the people from public to private sector, they said, yeah, we need to push this agenda of collective and so on and so forth. That's one thing. Then, of course, reality is not as shiny, and then I will say these spaces are quite, as I said in the presentation, they are quite challenging for the administrations, because they are posing many problems and situations they want to avoid. I will give you a couple of examples. For example, what we said, for example, oh, it will be, and talking about, let's say, the apartments or collective areas, it doesn't matter. If you say, yeah, let's have full, a kind of transparent views, you know, and let's have the space and like terraces or long balconies exposing everything, what they see is not people having fun and enjoying their housing apartments, or let's say their apartments, but actually they see trash, they see pigeons, they see laundry machines that are not working, they see basically trash, right? They don't want to see this part of the, let's say, of life, right? Then in the case of the palier partagé, the vertical commons, of course, we won with this idea, and I will say very the feedback we received by the jury was totally clear that they really liked the proposal with all its complexity. But then during the process, of course, the institution in charge was not totally convinced to have this vertical commons. And so at one moment they were suggesting, what if we take some of them out? Or what if we take the facade, the glass facade out? Because of one thing or another. There are many subjects arriving to this question, to this space, because it's circulation. So there is a question of fire security, there is a question of wind, there is a question of that you want, at the same time, we as architects, we want to create a room. They see that this should be only a circulation. So I would say, coming back to your question, this is a place of a space of conflict. And in our case, we were, I would say, just all the time trying to maintain, to keep our agenda, and that these spaces are non-negotiable somehow. So even though we know that they can fail, because we, of course, we don't know the people that will live there necessarily or whatever, we strongly believe that there is a need to have these in-between spaces in between your apartment and the city, right? So even though, and I can give you another example in coming back to the inhabitants, because we met the inhabitants a couple of times, and then the inhabitants in the beginning, they were not so happy about to have these spaces. They were saying, yeah, but I don't want people like playing ping pong or doing yoga or whatever next to my kitchen, you know, like this is my place, and I don't make trouble. I don't want to talk with many people, so leave me alone somehow. But then through the process, and after, of course, introducing references and ideas and doing exercises and so on and so forth in this kind of participatory process, you start to convince them that this could be a place they need, and it is an extra, and it's a place they don't need to have inside their apartments, but actually that can be shared. So we started, of course, this programmation with them, and then what you saw, the series of objects, we were hearing them, but also trying to incorporate other things that they might not imagine, because their imagination is, of course, very limited, because we live in a context of fragmentation, right? So.
Alison, do you want to ask something?
Thank you for your lecture. There's 5 of us here in our room. We're in the Projective Cities program. I also Klaus' question. I've also been thinking a lot about agency over these spaces and how you well, I think that it ties into the specificity of the space itself, or whether or not this kind of space production or production of space, whether it's through a platform or through some kind of carved out element, if you think that there has to be a specific resource that is being provided, or that is being communicated, and then I think the second part to the question is, how do you create a sense of agency for people to have over the space that would more or less encourage use, but also maintenance of the space, or some kind of caretaking or responsibility of the space, rather than it becoming kind of these in between or no man's land corridors with plants that perhaps die after 3 months. And I mean, yeah, maybe if you could shed some light on these spaces over time, and also the specific populations that these spaces are considering, and the importance of not creating an exclusivity, but creating an otherness or confluence of many parties? I'm sorry, these are many questions.
Yeah, no, but
One long-winded sentence.
I imagine I get your point. So let's, yeah, I can give you some ideas. First of all, I will say, and perhaps even coming back to the first question by Raúl, is that there is something, of course, like decision makers or let's say real estate promoter, real estate people, whatever, they don't want to pay more about them. So they don't want to say, yeah, we will give you a very amazing apartment and we will offer you amazing terraces. So this will mean that your business will be less interesting. This is not the point for them, of course. And this is even coming back to the administration of these spaces. There is also a problem with them, at least in here, because these extra square meters should be part of, in the end, they should fit in an Excel sheet. So they need to say, yeah, these are part of the total square meters. So at one moment you have, or you have circulations, or you have your, let's say, the square meters of your apartment. This in between is a kind of tricky. That's why we found them extremely interesting, because they are not domain of nobody. So it depends of course, it's a little bit of risk, but then it depends on the communities, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I will not support the fact that to have less space, not necessarily, let's say, because there are some cases that are extremely exemplary on this, but I will not necessarily support the fact to have less space in the domestic area, to have more space in the collective spaces, in the collective area, collective realm, right? So this idea of the monk and the cell, I will say it's super interesting, but then it's not the only one, right? So it doesn't mean, what I'm saying is that ideally we could have like very nice apartments and then very nice and generous extra spaces or collective areas. That's the second thing. The third thing, it's about what you were suggesting about the agency. I will say on this, of course, if we leave like an open platform in the, I don't know, in the 8th floor in winter in Paris, where there is a lot of wind, you know, like there is a lot of, it is not very nice to be there, you know, to spend your time. You will not work there for 2 hours because you will get cold, whatever. Of course, this is also pointless. I will say we need to offer the most basic infrastructure and conditions for that spaces to evolve. Okay, so in this case, and coming back to a discussion on them with Lacaton and Basal, because you might know that Lacaton and Basal, all their efforts are part of the private realm and not necessarily in the collective realm. So that's why I find there is a new generation which is taking the model much more far, let's say, in a much more interesting way even, is that they say, yeah, but this is why you don't need like an exterior room to meet with your neighbors. You can meet in your apartment. So let's offer more space in the apartment. But then for me, we are at the moment that we are so fragmented that we need to, again, to find spaces at the scale of our existence, let's say, in this case, in collective housing, where we could gather and we could start conversations again. So I will say in this case that we need to offer some basic infrastructure. So for example, we imagine that plants can be, like neighbors can have their plants, of course, and we will not animate the space. We will not go to IKEA to buy the tables and they are all red or they are all white, it doesn't matter. But we should have like places for example, cleaning things like plates or dishes, I don't know. We should have access to water. We should have access to energy. We should have, for example, if we want people that go to do exercise there, we could have things hanging that people can use freely. Perhaps it is not the total sequence for a guy that or someone that wants to exercise for 2 hours, but at least the basic infrastructure to really start imagining these places as something more. But I strongly believe that in a way, again, these are spaces for experimentation. and then they can be extremely useful. They can be extremely like places for life, but then it depends a lot on the relationships in between neighbors. So if it's in this case, in our case, we didn't have the chance to build them yet. We will start probably by the end of the year or by the beginning of the next year, this project with the vertical commons. So we will see. But then, of course, let's say the responsible of the community is quite relevant, quite important, and that's why I will say the most, let's say, probably the most successful cases on housing is when you have an organized and engaged community, such as La Borda Cooperative or I don't know, Maestranza neighborhood by Ucamau in Santiago.
Great, thank you.
Hello, Felipe.
Hi.
Thank you for your lecture. I was wondering the relationship between OnArchitecture and your practice, Plan Común. I remember when I was firstly visit your OnArchitecture, I was really fascinated by this curating ability, and when I saw the video, I felt almost the quality of the space, which is very absent from the plan and everything. Also, yeah, this dialectical relation between your practice, because you're always saying this maximizing space, and you're also giving a lot of numbers, which means it's about quantity. Of course, the OnArchitecture is about quality, as I told you. So, can you elaborate more about this? How this quality can be affected to your practice, or also, yeah, other way around?
Thank you very much for your question. I find it extremely nice, because normally we don't talk. I don't receive this type of questions normally, and I find it extremely relevant in the work we are doing. Of course, I'm representing in this case a practice with 3 other partners. So if you ask them, probably their backgrounds, their professional backgrounds, or their experience have been extremely influential for the way they are dealing with architecture today. But in our case, the thing to start with this archive and as I said before, to go there, to spend time visiting, seeing the stuff. I would say much more time than one spend as tourist, going there, a couple of pictures, and then go out. To really to spend a little bit of time in the projects, and then to talk with the authors has been totally fundamental, and I will say it determines our individual parkour, my parkour totally. I can, of course, I will not say anything about the in-between condition if I will not meet Lacaton and Basal back in 2009 for the first time, for example. This is a totally one thing to consider. I will not talk about our interest in the collective if I will not met Vittorio Aureli in 2009 as well, or 2010 or something like this. So it has been a lot of people, very diverse. So I'm just talking about 2 people, but then we can talk about the militant architecture by Paulo Mendes da Rocha and several other people, several other authors. That has been, of course, very inspiring for us. And I said us because we need to remember that Plan Común was founded by me and the other partners are at OnArchitecture, Diego Gras. So basically, we took this idea of transferring knowledge from one kind of theoretical background or critical thinking towards a conventional practice of architecture. So coming back to your question, I will say this relationship exists, and in the beginning was quite even more, I will say, radical in a way, because of course we were, you need to imagine that back in 2012 when we started with OnArchitecture and Plan Común, we had like 150 videos, and nowadays we have 600 videos. So the universe of discussions, subjects, it's much more diverse now, probably. But in the beginning was really like, I don't know, like specific authors that were totally influential, and we were having somehow the conversation about these very few arguments. So in the beginning, we were quite literal in the way we were, I will say, transferring their ideas. So that's why I introduced this first competition we did at architecture school in Santiago, because at that moment, La Catona and Basal wasn't not at all new Santiago. Probably they were kind of neglected or kind of invisible architects in comparison with others. And we said their strategy, that they are applying the strategy of extra spaces in social housing, the extra spaces and the idea of having this plus somehow the extensions, we can apply this to any transformation. So we imagine, okay, we are not dealing anymore with a new building, but actually we are dealing with transforming a pre-existing structure within the campus. So we are taking advantage of what was there. I will say this, I don't know if I was clear enough, but then it has been super relevant. And then the way we film, of course, was quite related with the way we were representing our own architecture. The places we were projecting were much more in tune with the things we were filming as well. So it was a constantly, I will say, it has been a constant exercise and self-formation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Any more questions? Christina, do you want to ask something?
Hello, Felipe. Well, some of the questions that I had already been said, because I was interested in the idea of the space of conflict and the concept, and you already has elaborated about that, and also the way that the way you are filming are also kind of connected with the way you are projecting. So some thoughts has already been said. Maybe I had the feeling that also the conversations with the different kind of teams has been influential, but I was also wondering if this idea of the failure and also the idea of the knowledge that it's common, it's something that you had already been kind of checking by being there, no? So maybe this idea of the informal occupancy, the post-occupancy and the role. So yeah, and if there is kind of certain conclusions or learnings from this in that line.
Super, Christina. Thank you very much. No, I will say you're right. This idea of architecture as a common field of knowledge, I will say it arrives. Of course, this the presentation is very kind of linear. So you understand, this guy is talking about this and then jumps. But of course, these are the ideas that superimpose ideas. So this idea of architecture as a common field of knowledge, I will say it's from just before to come to Europe, to be based in Europe. And actually, it was somehow, we were super critical. We have been super critical since we were students about architecture as a kind of architecture for the elites, and the way we were dealing with architecture in our school of architecture, which is very elitist, the Universidad Católica in Chile. So we were somehow promoted to be as a new kind of the next genius after this golden generation. They at one moment they even start to talk about golden generation to very few architects, very skilled architects, of course, but then that we're dealing with not totally, but mainly with the commissions that were for the very few, right? So at one moment we were also noticing that there is somehow that architecture, and coming back to this idea of Budowski about that architecture can be everywhere, that architecture that you can find more architecture in a kind of popular neighborhood, seeing a detail of the, I don't know, of a fence, rather than when you go visit conventional architecture work. So And again, lastly, this idea of architecture as a common field of knowledge has to do also with the fact that we are a lot of architects. There are many architects all over the world, and the possibilities for building architecture, they are quite few for all the people that is dealing with architecture. So it means that to say architecture is about the built environment or about a building, I would say it's totally unfair with our own, situation. So I would say, for me, I never did the distinction in between a book or in between a project that will be built or something, or even a paper project, because we already know as well that there are many projects quite amazingly relevant that they were never built. So that's the first thing. Coming back to the second part of the question about the learnings, I would say, of course, it's the most amazing also, and this is interesting because when we started in 2006, a very close friend of us at the Católica architecture school, an old professor there called Rodrigo Pérez de Arce, who actually was teaching in Atelier for 17 years or something like this. Rodrigo actually, he was one of our supporters when we were doing this project, when we were back at the school, and he was the first kind of review he did was about actually comparing our way of filming, which was very trash because we were with our cameras like this, like without any skills of filming architecture, and then with the pictures of El Croquis. And he was saying something which is now obvious, which that El Croquis, of course, they were no objects, no life. All the time there was the best conditions, the weather conditions, so every time sunny or with the very kind of gray atmosphere where you focus only in the space, but it was quite the use was quite invisible in a way. So of course, every time we go to a place, it's an amazing possibility to see how the people is used and even misunderstood, because this is happening also, that the inhabitants doesn't have a kind of I will say like property regulation, they say, okay, let's follow the architect's desire. Not at all. So if they see an opportunity to hang a t-shirt for whatever in a handrail, they will do it. And if there is a space to leave their laundry machine broken, they will leave it as well. So this has been totally inspiring, and we are of course interested in this space as these contradictory spaces where you can find real life. So and of course, coming back also, but this is kind of the anecdote when we visit them and we see them, of course, we without any mediation, without any filter, how the spaces behave. But then of course there are other cases where you are able, in your case, to project this, or somehow this, you are giving enough space for the unexpected to happen in the case of La Borda. So I will say yes. I don't know if I was clear enough, but you can.
Yeah, thank you very much.
But you can help me if I'm not clear.
I think we're going to have one last question from the audience. Hamid, do you want to ask something?
Yeah, I can follow up quickly on what Christina asked, but from another direction. You interestingly said, Felipe, that you are operating as a conventional architectural office, but every project is a wider collaboration from your core team, and you're involving many other offices and experts and artists and practitioners and academics. So in a way, there seemed to be something different from a conventional office. I mean, I don't know if it's a generosity or if it's a kind of a strategy in order to collectivize knowledge production and also architectural production. So if you can elaborate a bit on that, I would be very interested.
So Ahmed, very good question. I have to say that it's not a false modesty to talk about our conventional way of dealing with architecture, but in a way, sorry, because Christina is here, but if we come back to the activity of La Col, for example, this is quite exemplary, right? People that is able to really to gather each other and to create this cooperative. In our case, this is conventional because we are a private, independent, but private company, a small company. So we have partners, we have 4 partners. We are sharing the, we need to keep us working a lot in order to sustain our lifestyle or even our practice in the context of the Parisian context, which is quite, I would say, stressful and quite demanding because of, you know already that Paris is very, very expensive. But of course, we say this. I said this because I on the one side, I truly believe that there is a component of we are conventional in a way because like a normal practice with 4 partners. But then I totally agree with you on the fact that there is this, we are less conventional when we are dealing with collaboration. We saw since the very beginning, and in the case we collaborate with you back in 2013, that collaboration is in itself as a project. We were also convinced by our schools and also by other architects that architecture is about competition, and I totally believe that is the opposite. The problem is that competition actually put us in a very fragile situation because there is this old saying that, well, if you don't do it, there will be another architect that will take the commission for nothing, and this is totally wrong and totally perverted. So at what moment we started to see that instead to compete, and it doesn't mean that you are not critical, right? But instead to compete, we could, of course, gather knowledge for different for different projects. And in this case, to be totally honest and transparent with you, all the projects I show you, probably almost all the projects I show you in doing our the French phase of Plan Común, we weren't able to do these projects alone. Not because we have some lack of knowledge to do them. We don't have the expertise in such complex questions, such as transform and exist a social housing building. Like dealing with all the technical issues. We don't have the necessarily the administrative figure to apply to these competitions. So in this case, for example, when we associated with Kun Malvesi and Nicolas Valvori, of course, it was a matter of collaborating with people we know each other since several years ago. Wilfred Kuhn was invited by us 2 times to Santiago. We wrote some articles together. We discussed many times about architecture and other subjects. We are friends, so at one moment we want to work with friends. And of course, if we are able to participate in a process that are much more ambitious and much more bigger than the structure that we have, great. So this will be, I will say, it was less opportunistic since the very beginning, is that we look for our partners, and the right partners means not only to have the right portfolio, but actually projects where we can have fun and we can go to the to the limits of it. So I will say the cases I show you, especially, for example, the one of the transformation of the tower with 51 M4E was one of the best examples since 2012, because the collaboration was awesome with them. They had an amazing knowledge on subjects we didn't, and then they were super also generous during the whole process. So we were able actually to really work together, to really believe in this idea of collective intelligence to arrive to a project we are both somehow proud of.
Thank you so much, Felipe.
Thank you so much, Felipe. I think we should close it here. It was a fantastic lecture. We're very grateful to you and Plan Común for being with us this afternoon. And I really do hope to find more ways of collaborating and working together in the future. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
And for all the questions and for all the people, friends that are online today. Ciao, ciao.
Great. Ciao. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.